Corporate training taught you the process, not how to win real conversations in the field. If you've ever felt overlooked or unsure how to speak up with the store manager, you're in the right place. Welcome to Built for Retail Field Reps. I'm Sylvia Gonzalez, a retail fields leader, author, and creator of the S.E.L.L.S method. This podcast breaks down what corporate never taught you about confidence, sales, and winning, so you can show up strong and trust yourself in the field. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Built for Retail Field Reps. If you listened to episode 1 last week, we talked about getting honest with yourself, getting honest about where you stand in your current role. Because before you elevate, before you ask for more, and before you start pushing yourself in the field, you need clarity. But today, I want to talk about something almost every field rep experiences at some point, and that is this. Corporate training does not prepare you for real conversations in the field. Now, let me be clear before anyone listening thinks I'm knocking corporate training completely. That's not what I'm saying. Corporate training absolutely has its place. In fact, most companies onboard you through some type of training process. And that usually means you're watching modules, learning the systems, learning the programs, and understanding the company expectations. You're getting familiar with the product knowledge, right? You know, the promotions, the processes, all of that stuff. And every company trains a little differently, but that's a whole other conversation for another day. But here's the real deal. The training that actually prepares you for the field doesn't come from those corporate modules. It comes when you're actually in stores, side by side, getting that one-on-one experience with someone who shows you how things really work in the field. And that training depends entirely on the experience of the person you're with. Now, let me repeat that. Your real field training depends entirely on the experience of the person that's training you. If you're lucky enough to train with someone who understands how to navigate store conversations, how to handle objections, and build relationships with managers, you are lucky. You are going to learn a lot. But if you're not as lucky, then most of what corporate training gave you, which was just knowledge of products, knowledge of the programs and knowledge of the processes, what corporate training, usually doesn't teach you is how to handle real conversations with real people in real stores. And that's the part I want to talk about today. Because what happens in the training module phase, the onboarding phase, is very different from what happens when you're standing in front of a busy store manager who has 10, 20 million things going on and maybe just 30 seconds to hear what you have to say. And if you've ever walked out of a store thinking, man, that conversation felt so awkward, or shoot, I didn't even ask for the space I came in for, you're not alone. And most importantly, you're not the problem. Let me give you an example from the field. There were many times when I would go out and I'd walk stores with my reps during one-on-one visits. And when we walk a store, I usually let the rep take the lead because I want to observe how they approach the visit. I want to see how, they handle interaction. And one of the things I actually teach in my private coaching is something really simple, but very powerful. that I wanted to include here is when you're asking someone a question in the store, use their name whenever possible if you don't already know their name. Okay, look at their name tag. If it says Christina, use it. So using someone's name immediately makes the interaction just more respectful. And you're not just another vendor, walking in asking questions. So I don't remember the exact name that was used on that day, but we're going to stick with Christina for this example. So I remember my rep proceeded and said, "Hey, good morning, Christina. Is Mike, the manager, here today?" And the response was, "Yeah, he's here, but he's busy." Now, here's the moment that caught my attention. The manager hasn't even said no. I mean, yet alone, the manager hasn't even came out yet. But I can already see my rep's body language just change. Her shoulders dropped a little bit, her tone shifts, and suddenly the energy was, "Okay, well, I'll come back maybe later." And just like that, the conversation starts shutting down before it even begins. And here's another scenario that happens too. Sometimes the clerk is going to say, "Yeah, he's here. Let me go grab him for you." And then, a moment later, the manager walks out. And now, the rep is there face to face with the manager. And this is where something really interesting happens psychologically. Because the moment the authority figure appears, you can literally see the shift. Like the posture changes, confidence drops a little bit, voice gets a little quieter. And this is something psychologists have studied for decades. There's a concept in social psychology called the deference to authority. One of the most well-known studies around this came out of Yale University, the Milgram obedience experiments. And what those experiments showed was that people naturally defer or step back when they perceive someone as an authority figure. And what's interesting about those studies is that people didn't suddenly become less capable. They didn't suddenly become less intelligent. What changed was their perception of authority. The moment the brain detects someone as having authority, something subtle happens. Your brain stops focusing on influence and starts focusing on approval. So instead of thinking, "How do I present this idea clearly?" the brain starts to think, "How do I not say the wrong thing?" Or "How do I make sure they're not going to get annoyed by me?" And that shift right there is where confidence starts to disappear. Now, obviously, we're not in a psychology lab when we walk into a grocery store, but the same instinct shows up in the field. Okay. The store manager becomes the authority figure. And suddenly the brain starts sending signals like, "Don't push too hard. Don't take up too much time. Don't bother them." And that internal shift shows up immediately in your posture, your tone, your confidence. Managers aren't rejecting your idea yet. It's your brain is already rejecting the conversation before it even starts. And I watched this happen over and over again. A rep walks into the store confident, but the moment the managers appear, like they shift into approval mode instead of leadership mode. And that's a huge difference because when you're in approval mode, you're trying not to upset the person in front of you. But when you're in leadership mode, you're focused on bringing a solution to the conversation. And that internal shift doesn't just stay in your head. It shows up in behavior. It shows up in the way reps approach the store. And it shows up in the way that you approach conversations, with managers. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation. Sometimes it shows up as ending the conversation way too quickly. And sometimes it shows up in a way that looks productive on the surface, but is actually avoidance. And one of the most common ways, like I've seen that happen in the field, is during the store walk. Because the store walk can either be a powerful, like, preparation tool, or it can become a way to delay the conversation. And that's where I want to add a little nuance to this, because walking the store before talking to the manager is not a bad thing. Okay. In fact, when I was a sales rep myself back in the day, I absolutely did a quick store walk first. I would check my displays, and see if product had moved. I looked at how things were executing. That way, when I approached the manager, I wasn't walking up empty handed. Okay. I can say something like, "Hey, Mike, I noticed we already sold through 2 cases on that display by the entrance," or "that end cap is moving really well. I think we could keep that momentum going through the weekend." Now the manager immediately sees that you're paying attention to their store. But the store walk also serves another purpose, right? It's a chance to look for opportunity. And this is something I teach in my coaching as well. When you're walking the store, you're not just observing, okay? You're seeking opportunity. Maybe you notice a display that's almost empty, and or maybe another brand's display is gone, and or maybe there's an open secondary space. So those moments where you can approach the manager and say, "Hey, Mike, I noticed that display over there, and by the milk is almost empty. Would you be open to us filling that space with this program?" Now you're walking up prepared. You're walking up with an idea. But there's a big difference, okay, between preparation and avoidance. And I remember one rep in particular who would walk the store, but then she would keep walking the store and walking the store. Like she was trying to straighten, all the product and fix the tags and rearrange and make it look good and perfect. And I asked her, like, why do you work the aisle and do all this before you even speaking to the store manager? And she said something really honest. She said, "I just want everything to look perfect before I talk to them." But what she was really saying was, "I don't want to hear no." So that's the difference. Okay. Preparation helps you approach the conversation with confidence. Avoidance delays the opportunity. And here's the thing most reps don't realize: the difference between someone who feels nervous approaching a manager and someone who walks up confidently is preparation, but not the kind of preparation corporate teaches. Okay. It's store awareness. Strong reps, they walk into a store and they start scanning the environment. They're asking themselves questions like, where is product moving? Or where is space opening up? What displays are empty? What opportunities exist here? Because when you approach a manager with an idea instead of a request, the conversation shifts immediately. So now you're not just another vendor asking for space. You're someone bringing a solution. Okay. And that's a completely different energy. I remember one rep in particular who struggled with this. I mean, she would come into the store, she'd do her tasks, and try to leave before the manager interaction even happened. Like the thought of that conversation intimidated her. So during one of our store visits, we walked through it: how to approach the manager, how to start the conversation and how to see, the manager as someone, like not to avoid, because they're someone that we should be partnering with. Okay. And over time, something really cool happened. Her relationship with that manager changed. Instead of avoiding the interaction, she started looking forward to it. They started, talking about ideas in the store. They collaborated on displays, and her store visits became something she genuinely enjoyed. And honestly, that probably would have never happened if she didn't have the tools that I provided to navigate those conversations. Most reps are not lacking effort at all. Some are very motivated. They're just lacking the tools to navigate conversations, the tools to handle objections, the tools to build partnerships. That's exactly why I created something I teach called the ART framework. A stands for acknowledge. R stands for reframe. T stands for tie down. So let's take the most common objection, in retail. Now, I don't know about you, but I would always hear, we don't have space. We don't have space right now. So step one, we acknowledge that. So that can be something like, totally fair. Space is tight. Okay. And then step number two, we're going to reframe that. Okay. And we would say something like, well, that's actually why I thought this might help move some of the product that's already been sitting here. And step three, your tie down would be something like this. Would you be open to trying it through the weekend and seeing how it performs? So now the conversation continues instead of stopping. Okay. So that matters because frameworks like ART don't magically make managers say yes, by all means. So what they do is give you the confidence to stay in the conversation. And that alone changes everything. Okay. So now the important thing to understand about the ART framework is that it's not just about one objection. Okay. Managers are going to give you all kinds of pushback in the field. Another objection that I would hear all the time and my reps would hear all the time is maybe next time. So now on the surface, that sounds polite, right? But most reps hear maybe next time as a soft no. Okay. And the conversation usually ends right there. But let's walk through how you can handle that, using my ART framework. So first, step one, acknowledge. So you can say something like, totally understand, timing matters. So right away, you're showing the manager that you're not pushing against them. Okay. You're recognizing their perspective, right? And second step would be to reframe the value. So you might say something like, that's actually why I wanted to show you this now. It's also the tone, and the way you say it. Okay. And so now you're shifting the conversation away from the objection and back toward the opportunity. So you're helping them see why the idea might still make sense. Okay. And then comes the third step, which is the tie down. And this is where a lot of reps struggle because they don't want to feel pushy, but tying it down doesn't mean pushing. You're not being pushy. It just simply means you're asking for a small next step. So you might say something like, would you be open to trying it on the next delivery? Or would you be open to testing it for the weekend and seeing how it performs? So now the conversation continues. So instead of ending the moment, that the objection appears, you've created the space for the manager to consider the idea. And that's really what the ART framework does. It keeps the conversation moving forward. Because in the field, objections are not the end of the conversation, at least not in Sylvia's eyes. They're usually just the beginning of the real conversation. If handling objections is something that you struggle with in the field, I created a free objections guide for retail field reps. So inside it, I break down the ART framework and I give you examples of how to respond confidently, when managers push back. And you can grab that guide in the show notes. I'll include it below, or you can visit thesalesmethod.com and download it there. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this episode, it's this. Most reps don't struggle in the field because they don't care. They struggle because no one ever taught them how to handle the moment when the conversation gets uncomfortable. And that moment is exactly where growth happens. Because the difference between a rep who stays stuck, okay, and a rep who elevates is the willingness to stay in the conversation. So next week, we're going to talk about something I see all the time in stores. Why even good reps shrink in conversations with store managers and how to stop doing it. If this episode helped you, share it with another field rep who could benefit from it. And remember, confident reps get bigger wins. Build the skill, master the system. I'll see you next week. Thank you for joining me.